The $47 million sitting in my personal brokerage account felt almost abstract that morning, just numbers on a screen, until I pulled into my in-laws' driveway and remembered exactly how I'd gotten here. My ex-husband's sister was getting married on a Saturday in June at a vineyard in Napa that cost more per hour than most people made in a month. I hadn't planned to come. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, addressed in that careful, looping handwriting my former mother-in-law always used when she was performing graciousness. The kind that meant nothing and cost her nothing. We'd love for you to be there. You're still family, of course. Of course. The way she said of course had always meant the opposite. I almost threw it away. I stood over the recycling bin in my kitchen for a full minute, the thick cream envelope in my hand, before something stopped me. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe just curiosity. Maybe I needed to see it one more time, the whole performance of them, before I let it go for good. So I went. My name is Lena. I was 28 when I married into the Caldwell family, 31 when I left, and 34 now. In those 3 years between, I built something they never saw coming because they never looked. The vineyard was called Archer Estate. Rolling hills, white tents, string lights that would look magical in the dark. When I arrived, I was wearing a navy dress I'd bought off the rack at Nordstrom 3 years ago. I still fit into it. I'd chosen it deliberately. Nothing that screamed money, nothing that invited questions. I parked my own car, a slate grey Volvo, in the general lot. My attorney had offered to send a car. I told her no. I wanted to arrive the same way I'd left, quietly, on my own terms. My ex-mother-in-law saw me first. Her name was Charlotte, and she had the posture of a woman who had spent 40 years deciding who was and was her attention. She smiled when she spotted me near the entrance, that practiced smile that touched everything except her eyes. "Lena," she said, leaning in for a cheek kiss she didn't complete. "You came. How brave." Brave. I turned the word over for a second. "It's a beautiful venue," I said. "Congratulations on Haley's big day." Charlotte's gaze did a quick sweep of my dress, my hair, my shoes. I watched her file it all away. No designer labels. No jewelry worth noting. "Same Lena," she was concluding. "Still managing." Her husband, my former father-in-law, found us a few minutes later. His name was Robert. Robert Caldwell had been a regional VP at a mid-size investment bank for the better part of 2 decades and carried himself like he'd invented the concept of money. He gripped my hand once, firmly, the way men do when they want to establish something. "Didn't know you were coming," he said. It wasn't a complaint exactly, more like a notation. "Charlotte invited me," I said pleasantly. Right. He glanced around, already looking for someone more interesting. "You still doing that little consulting thing?" "That little consulting thing?" "That little consulting thing?" I smiled. "Something like that." I found my seat at a table near the back, not the back of shame, but the back of courtesy, the place you put someone you weren't sure what to do with. My former brother-in-law, Miles, was seated across from me. Miles was 37, deeply tanned from a summer of sailing he liked to mention whenever possible, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about his own importance. He was the one my ex-husband, Carter, had always deferred to. The family compass. Carter wasn't there yet. We'd been divorced for 14 months. The split had been civil on paper and brutal underneath, the way those things usually are. He'd kept the apartment. I'd kept the business. I'd been building quietly for the 2 years before I left. He didn't know what it was worth when we signed the papers. I'm not sure he'd ever really asked. Miles spotted me and came over, drink in hand, looking genuinely amused. "Lena, wow, you actually showed." "I love Haley," I said. Which was true. Haley was 26, sweet in a way the rest of her family wasn't, and the only Caldwell who had called me after the divorce to say she was sorry it hadn't worked out. Miles sat down uninvited. "So what are you up to these days? Charlotte mentioned you were doing some kind of freelance finance thing." "I run a firm," I said. Right was a Caldwell habit. It meant they'd heard you and had immediately assigned you to a category that didn't require further attention. Boutique. Like small. I looked at him, growing. He smiled like I'd said something charming and moved on to tell me about a deal his company was closing in Austin. I listened with the expression I'd perfected over 3 years of Caldwell dinners, attentive, unreadable, slightly warm. The expression that meant nothing was landing. The ceremony was beautiful. Haley cried, her groom cried, half the vineyard cried. I sat in the white folding chair and thought about the morning 2 years ago when I'd signed the lease on my first real office space, 400 square feet above a dry cleaner in Oakland, with a window that looked out on a parking structure. I'd sat at a folding table with my business partner Theo, and we'd eaten lukewarm takeout and looked at each other and said, "This is it. This is real now." Theo had come up with the initial model, a software platform that automated compliance reporting for mid-market private equity funds, the kind of tedious regulatory work that cost firms thousands of hours a year and was begging to be systematized. I understood the market. I'd spent 2 years at a fund of funds before I married Carter, and I'd seen exactly where the inefficiencies lived. We built around them, quietly, without announcing ourselves. By the time I sat down to Haley's wedding reception, Alden Bay Compliance Solutions had 41 institutional clients, contracts in 7 states, and the net revenue run rate that my CPA described as genuinely alarming in the best way. We turned down 2 acquisition offers in the past year. The third one, from a strategic buyer in the enterprise software space, was currently in the final stages of negotiation. My personal equity stake in that deal, if it closed as expected, would land somewhere north of $40 million. I had not told a single Caldwell any of this. Carter arrived during cocktail hour. I saw him across the tent before he saw me. Tall, easy smile, the same blue blazer he'd owned since we were married. He looked good. He always looked good. That had never been the problem. He spotted me a moment later, and his expression did something complicated, cycling through surprise and then something I might have called guilt, before settling into the careful neutrality we'd both learned. "Hey," he said, reaching me. "Didn't know you'd be here." "Haley's my friend," I said. "Right." He glanced around, the same wee flex as his father. "You look good." "Thanks. So do you." Silence opened between us. We'd once been good at talking, or I'd thought we were. Now I understood that what I'd mistaken for intimacy had mostly been me filling in the gaps he left. "How's work?" he asked. "Good," I said, "growing." He nodded slowly. "Still the compliance software thing?" "Still. That word. Yes. Cool." He reached for a glass from a passing tray. "We just closed a Series B at the firm, so things are moving fast on my end." He said it the way he said most things, expecting it to impress, not particularly wondering if it did. "Congratulations," I said. He smiled, relieved that the awkwardness was passing, and drifted toward his family. I watched him go and felt nothing. I hadn't already processed in a therapist's office over 14 months of rebuilding myself into someone I actually recognized. Dinner was seated. I was between a college friend of Haley's and an older couple who were friends of the family from Connecticut. The college friend, a woman named Jules who worked in environmental law, was the best conversation I'd had all day. We talked about housing policy and bad first apartments and whether Napa had peaked. She didn't ask what I did for work, which I found deeply refreshing. The trouble started somewhere around the main course. Robert had positioned himself at the table adjacent to mine, close enough that his voice carried easily. He was talking to 2 men I didn't know, friends of his from the banking world, I gathered, and his voice had risen to the register he used when performing for an audience. "The problem with this generation," he was saying, cutting into his steak, "is they want the reward without the discipline. Real wealth takes decades. There are no shortcuts." He laughed. "Believe me, I've seen every shortcut fail." One of the men asked him something I couldn't fully hear. "Family," Robert said. "Oh, we've had our examples of that too. My son's ex-wife, sharp girl, don't get me wrong, but never could translate that into something real. You know the type. Lots of ideas, no follow-through." He shook his head with what looked like genuine regret. "Carter's better off." I set down my fork very gently. Jules glanced at me. I gave her a small smile that said it's fine, and then looked down at my plate, and I thought, not yet. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I glanced at it under the table. A message from my attorney. Final term sheet is in. Buyer accepted all material terms. We're ready to sign when you are. Congratulations, Lena. This is a big one. I read it twice. Then I locked the screen and placed the phone back in my clutch. The number wasn't quite 47 million anymore. It was 49 after the final adjustments. I picked up my fork and finished my chicken. Charlotte materialized beside me during dessert, a glass of champagne in hand, in the way she always had, appearing without approaching, as if she'd simply been there all along. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked, with the warmth of someone conducting a survey. "It's a beautiful wedding," I said. She sat down in the empty chair beside me. A choice. That meant she had something to say. "You know," she began in her thoughtful voice, the one that preceded her least thoughtful observations, "I've always admired that you kept at it. After the divorce, that little business of yours." She tilted her head. "It's important to have something. Something." "It keeps me busy," I said. "Of course." She sipped her champagne. "I do think about you sometimes. Wonder if you're managing. Carter mentioned you'd turned down a job offer at one of the bigger firms last year. I thought that was, well, brave is the word, I suppose. Brave again. Risky, maybe, but brave." She thought I'd turned down a job because I was holding out for a better one. She had no framework for what I'd actually been doing. "I'm managing fine," I said. "Well?" She patted my hand. "You always were resourceful." Resourceful. I filed that one beside brave. Haley found me near the end of the evening, just after the cake. She was still in her dress, cheeks flushed, happiness radiating off her like something physical. "I'm so glad you came," she said, hugging me properly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wouldn't have missed it," I said, and I meant it. She pulled back and looked at me. Haley was the only person in her family who actually looked at people. "You seem different," she said. "Good different, like settled." "I am," I said. "Things are really good, actually." "Yeah?" Her eyes went warm with genuine interest. "Tell me." So I told her. Not everything, not the numbers, but enough. The company, the clients, the deal that was closing. I watched her face move through surprise, and then something that looked like relief, like she'd been hoping this for me and hadn't known it. "Lena," she said, "that's incredible." "It came together slowly," I said, and then all at once, she hugged me again. Over her shoulder, I could see her father across the tent, glass raised in some toast, laughing with his banking friends. He would find out eventually. Maybe through the press release when the acquisition closed, since the buyer was publicly traded and the deal would have to be disclosed. Maybe through someone who knew someone. Maybe through Carter, who would read it and feel something that I genuinely hoped would move him toward introspection, though I held that expectation loosely. They would all find out. And when they did, I wouldn't be there to see it. That was the point. I'd spent too long imagining a scene, the moment of recognition on Robert's face, the recalibration in Charlotte's voice, Carter understanding the full shape of what he'd never seen. I'd written that scene so many times in my head during the worst months after the divorce, when I was working 16-hour days in that 400-square-foot office and eating sad salads at my desk and wondering if I was delusional. What I understood now on the other side of it was that the scene didn't matter. The scene was for them. The work was for me. Haley squeezed my hand one more time and was pulled away by her new husband, spinning into the rest of her wedding night. I watched her go and felt something warm and uncomplicated, the kind of feeling that doesn't need an audience. I found my car in the general lot. The valley had gone gold in the evening light, the hills soft against a pale sky, and for a moment I just stood there with my hand on the door handle and breathed. In 3 days, I would sign the paperwork that would change the number on my screen into something that felt real in a different way. I would call Theo first because he'd been there from the beginning, sleeping 4 hours a night and believing in the model when most people would have quietly returned to their safe jobs. I would take my team to dinner somewhere good. I would probably cry in my car at some point, the way I always did when something large happened and I was alone with it. I would not call the Caldwells. I would not send a message to Robert, though I had thought about it. One of those clean, devastating one-liners that plays well in the fantasy version of events. I would not forward the press release to Carter with any comment. That had been tempting once. It wasn't anymore. On the drive back toward the city, I passed through a stretch of highway where the bay opened up on the left side and you could see the lights of Oakland beginning to come on in the dusk. I'd driven this road 100 times. The first time I drove it alone after the divorce, I'd pulled over and sat with my hazards on for 10 minutes, just trying to get my breathing under control, because the apartment was gone and the money was almost gone, and all I had was a half-built idea and a business partner who believed in it. That was the version of me they thought they still knew. The one who was managing, the one who was brave in the faintly condescending sense Charlotte meant. I merged back into traffic and turned up the radio. 3 days. The deal closed on a Tuesday. Theo and I were in my attorney's conference room on the 22nd floor, and when the final signatures landed and my attorney looked up from her laptop and said it's done, neither of us said anything for a moment. Theo made a sound somewhere between a laugh and something else. I looked out the window at the bay and thought about the parking structure I used to stare at through the office window above the dry cleaner, and how I used to measure progress in increments so small they were almost invisible, and how those increments were the whole thing, not the number. Not the closing, but the Tuesday morning I didn't quit, and the Wednesday and the Thursday. My phone buzzed, several messages at once, from people on our cap table who'd gotten word, congratulations stacked up on the screen. I scrolled past them to find the one from Haley, which had arrived before most of them. I knew it. I always knew you were going to do something like this. So proud of you. I held the phone for a minute and then I put it down and turned back to Theo and said, "Okay, where do you want to go for dinner?" He named a steakhouse in the financial district that we joked about since the beginning, the kind of place that required a reservation 6 weeks out and had a wine list the size of a small novel. The kind of place Robert Caldwell had probably taken clients to for 20 years. I booked it on the spot for 8 o'clock that night. The press release went out the following morning. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 trade publications and a financial news outlet. By the end of the day, it had made one of the aggregator newsletters that a lot of people in private equity read over their morning coffee. My phone rang late that afternoon, a number I didn't have saved. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. It was Carter. There was a pause after I said hello, a pause long enough that I knew he'd read it or seen it, or someone had told him, and he was working through what that meant. "Hey," he said finally. "Hi, Carter." Another pause. He stopped, start-eyed again. I saw the news. "Okay," I said in a neutral voice. 49 million, he said. Not a question exactly, more like he was testing whether the number was real by saying it out loud. "That's the number," I said. I heard him exhale. A long, slow exhale. A long, slow exhale. "Lena, I didn't know it was. I thought you were just—" "I know what you thought," I said. Not unkindly, just truthfully. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of the easy register he usually operated in. "I'm sorry," he said. I think I missed something about who you were." I looked out my office window. The bay was still blue in the afternoon light. "Yeah," I said, "you did. Is there anything—" He stopped himself. "Never mind. Congratulations, Lena. Seriously. You built something real." "I did," I said. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down and I sat with it for a moment. Not the triumph I'd imagined during the dark months, not the vindication, just something quieter. The sound of a chapter closing the way chapters actually close, not with a dramatic score but with a regular Tuesday afternoon and a phone call and the distant sound of a city doing its ordinary business outside the window. Robert called 2 days later. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail that I listened to once and then deleted. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. He said something about impressive work, and the family has always believed in you, and perhaps we could have lunch, perhaps we could, but not for his reasons. Charlotte texted, Haley told us. We always knew you had it in you. I read it and put my phone face down on my desk. They had not always known. That was not the truth of what had happened between us. But I found, when I examined what I actually felt, that I didn't need them to admit it. That need had burned itself out somewhere between the second year at 16-hour days and the morning I realized I was no longer doing the work to prove anything to anyone outside of myself. I was doing it because it was mine. The model, the clients, the Tuesday morning decisions, all of it mine in a way that no one could retrospectively claim credit for or reframe as something they'd always supported. Theo and I gave the core team a week off after the close. On the last day before the break, we gathered everyone in the small conference room and I talked about what came next, because the acquisition wasn't the end. It was a transition, and we had integration work ahead, and the product still had places to grow. And the people in that room were the reason any of it had been possible. After, one of our junior analysts, 23, first real job out of college, the kind of person who stayed late not because anyone asked, but because she genuinely wanted to understand how things worked, came up to me and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said. "When did you know it was going to work?" she asked. "Like, was there a moment?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I never knew for sure. I just knew I wasn't going to stop." She nodded slowly, turning that over. "Is that enough?" "It was enough for me," I said. "I can't promise it works out for everyone who tries. But the not stopping, that part I could control. So that's the part I focused on." She thought about that for a second, and then nodded once, like she was filing it somewhere useful, and said, "Thank you." That evening I drove home through the city, the long way, past the block where my first apartment after the divorce had been, a studio with thin walls and a heater that worked only aspirationally. I'd sat on the floor of that apartment some nights and done the math over and over, running projections on a spreadsheet until the numbers blurred, trying to find the version of the future where it worked out. Every time, the answer came back the same: it depends on whether you keep going. I parked outside my building and sat in the car for a minute, watching the street. A couple walked past with a dog. Someone was carrying groceries up from the corner store. The ordinary motion of an ordinary evening. I took out my phone and opened the company bank account, a habit from the lean years that I hadn't quite broken. The number that looked back at me was no longer the number I'd had to manage carefully, allocate precisely, stretched to cover payroll and cloud infrastructure and the cost of the legal entity that would eventually hold everything together. It was a different number now. I locked the screen. I got out of the car. I walked into my building and up 2 flights of stairs and into my apartment, which was quiet and mine, and I set down my keys and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the early dark. I thought about Robert's voicemail, which I had deleted. I thought about Charlotte's text, which I hadn't answered. I thought about Carter's voice saying 49 million, like he was testing the weight of it, and the pause before he said he was sorry, and the way sorry had sounded, for once, like he meant it. I thought about Haley at her wedding, saying I knew it, and how that had felt like the only recognition that actually landed, because it came from someone who'd been paying attention for the right reasons. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do in the evening, lights coming on in apartment windows, the low sound of traffic, someone's music faint through the wall. This was the thing no one told you about building something from nothing. The moment it was done, didn't feel like the movie version of itself. There was no swell of strings, no close-up on your face at the moment of realization. There was just the next ordinary moment, and the one after that, and the quiet accumulation of a life you'd chosen when you could have chosen an easier thing. I hadn't built it to show them. I thought I had for a while. During the worst of it, the anger had been useful, had been fuel, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But fuel burns off. What was left when it was gone was just the work itself, and the person I'd become by doing it, and the fact that those 2 things were enough. The tea cooled. I didn't answer Charlotte's text. I didn't call Robert back. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed early, and I slept better than I had in months, not because of the number, but because for the first time in a long time I had nothing left to prove. I keep thinking about Robert's voicemail. Not because it hurt, it didn't, not anymore, but because of the word he used. Impressive. As in, now that the number was public, now that a press release had made it undeniable, I had become impressive. The same work, the same decisions, the same years of 400-square-foot offices and spreadsheets, and not quitting, none of that had been impressive when it was invisible to him. Only the result was. And I think that's the thing I needed to understand before I could really let it go. What happened to me didn't happen because the universe was keeping score. It happened because of choices, mine and theirs. Robert chose to look at me and see someone who wasn't worth watching closely. Charlotte chose to frame her condescension as concern. Carter chose to share a life with me without ever really asking what I was building inside it. And I chose, every single morning for 2 years, to go back to that office anyway. Those choices accumulated. That's all it was. Cause and effect compounding quietly over time. The thing I couldn't have told you at the beginning, when I was eating sad salads at my desk and running the same projections for the 100th time, is that the work itself was teaching me something I hadn't set out to learn. It was teaching me integrity, not in a grand proclaimed sense, but in the small, daily sense. Doing the thing you said you'd do, keeping the commitments you made to your clients, to Theo, to yourself, even when no one was watching and no one would have known if you'd cut a corner. The Caldwells never saw that part. They only saw the absence of the result, and they made their judgments accordingly. But the character was forming in exactly the space they dismissed. Theo saw it. Hayley, in her way, saw it, or felt it, which is maybe more honest. The people who were actually paying attention to who I was, rather than what I could confirm for them about their own assumptions, those were the people who recognized something real before the press release gave them permission to. That distinction matters to me now more than the number does. I think about the junior analyst who asked me when I knew it was going to work, and I think she was asking the right question for the wrong reason. She wanted a moment of certainty she could locate and hold on to. But certainty isn't the thing that carries you through. What carries you through is something steadier and less glamorous. The discipline to keep thinking clearly when you're exhausted and scared, to keep solving the actual problem in front of you instead of the story you're telling yourself about it. Intelligence isn't what you were born with. It's what you do with the information you have, consistently over time. And then there's the part that's hardest to talk about without sounding like a greeting card. But I'll try anyway. You have to keep going after the fuel of anger burns off. I was angry for a while. It was useful. I won't pretend otherwise. But anger has a horizon, and when you reach it, you find out what's underneath. Whether there's something real driving you, or whether you were only ever running away from something rather than toward it. I was lucky. Underneath the anger was genuine love for the work itself. That was what lasted. I don't need the Caldwells to understand any of this. I don't need Carter to look back and see me clearly, though I think some part of him is starting to. I needed to understand it myself, which took longer than I would have liked and cost more than I expected, and was worth every bit of it. The deal closed on a Tuesday. It felt like a Tuesday. And that, more than anything, told me I'd built the right thing for the right reasons.